High Plains Drifter is one of Clint Eastwood's most unique, genre-bending westerns, so let's take a look at 20 things you didn't know about the movie, including the true story that inspired it, its hidden references to the Dollars Trilogy, and how it started a lifelong feud between Clint Eastwood and John Wayne. So High Plains Drifter actually started out as an original screenplay written by Ernest Tidyman, an Oscar-winning screenwriter and author best known for writing Shaft and The French Connection. And he was apparently inspired to write the story upon hearing about the infamous real-life murder of Kitty Genovese, whose death was believed to have had over 38 witnesses, yet not a single one of them reported anything to the police. So this is very similar to the way in which the townspeople of Largo stood idly by as their marshal was brutally murdered, with the film really delving into themes of community cowardice and silent complicity. So in 1972, Clint Eastwood had just finished up starring in Dirty Harry and Joe Kidd, and had recently made his directorial debut with the 1971 psychological thriller Play Misty for Me. And for his next film, Eastwood decided it was time to try his hand at making a western. So upon reading the original 9-page proposal for High Plains Drifter, he approached Universal about directing it, apparently really liking the story's offbeat quality. But with that being said, once the film got the green light, Eastwood brought in screenwriter Dean Reisner to provide uncredited revisions to the screenplay, apparently filling in various plot holes with allegory and black humor, very much influenced by Sergio Leone. So when it came to casting, Clint Eastwood opted to play the main character himself, despite also being the director, which was the start of a larger trend in his career, especially in regards to westerns. But for the rest of the cast, he typically went for actors that he'd already previously worked with. For instance, William O'Connell, who played the barber, had already worked with Eastwood on Paint Your Wagon, and Paul Brinegar, who played the saloon keeper, previously starred alongside Eastwood in Rawhide, as the character of Wishbone. Also, Buddy Van Horn, who plays Marshal Duncan, was actually Eastwood's longtime stunt double. So given that High Plains Drifter was only the second film that Clint Eastwood had ever directed, it was important for him to put together a talented, trustworthy team to help him behind the scenes. So for his cinematographer, he went for Bruce Surtees, who we first met on the set of Two Mules for Sister Sarah, before working together again on The Beguiled, Play Misty for Me, and Dirty Harry. And for a composer, he hired Dee Barton, who had previously composed parts of the score for his latest movie, Play Misty for Me. Now, one thing that Clint Eastwood and Universal didn't agree on in the early stages was where High Plains Drifter should be shot, because Universal wanted the movie to be filmed on its backlot, but Eastwood was keen to shoot on location. The only problem was that he didn't know where. However, one day when he was out scouting locations alone in his pickup truck, he came upon the Mono Lake area in California, which he thought would make for a highly photogenic and original setting for a western. Now, the only problem with the location that Clint Eastwood picked was that there wasn't really any pre-existing settlements in the area that could pass for a Wild West mining town. So Eastwood decided to build one from scratch, hiring over 50 technicians and construction workers to build 14 houses, a church, and a 2-story hotel. And what was even more impressive is that rather than just building facades, Eastwood requested that the buildings have fully fitted interiors, so that he could seamlessly shoot indoor scenes on site. So in the end, the town of Largo took 18 days to construct, but proved to be a huge undertaking that ended up using 150,000 feet of lumber. And later on in the shoot, when the town needed to be painted red, again Eastwood refused to cut corners, and had the whole set painted for real, using 380 gallons of paint in the process. Now, although Clint Eastwood was clearly willing to do whatever it took to make High Plains Drifter look as authentic as possible, he still managed to be surprisingly efficient in his filmmaking. For instance, in the end, the film actually came in under budget, and 2 days ahead of schedule, as Eastwood filmed the movie in sequence, and apparently even edited the movie on location in a log cabin on the shores of Mono Lake. And once the film was complete, Largo was burned to the ground, leaving no sign that it ever even existed. So as impressive as the movie was, High Plains Drifter was not without its fair share of mistakes. For instance, in the iconic scene where the stranger is stood on the porch watching the townspeople practice shooting, he takes a sip of his half-finished beer and says,
"No, you're gonna look awfully silly with that knife sticking up your ass."
And then, in the next shot, takes another sip from the same glass that's now nearly full. Also, during the scene in the general store where the stranger gives two children jars of candy, you can clearly see that they have plastic lids, despite plastic not yet being invented. So at this stage in Clint Eastwood's career, he was quickly becoming the face of the Western genre, having already played the stoic, cigar-smoking gunslinger in countless other films. As such, it was easy for casual moviegoers to assume that Eastwood was essentially playing the same character in each movie, especially given that they often shared similar outfits and mannerisms. And High Plains Drifter very much continued that trend, as the stranger wears a very similar hat to the man with no name, and is once again armed with a Colt single-action army that the character of Hogan uses in Two Mules for Sister Sarah. So considering that High Plains Drifter was the first Western that Clint Eastwood ever directed, it makes sense that he would be heavily influenced by Sergio Leone, given how many spaghetti westerns they made together. So whether intentional or not, High Plains Drifter is littered with callbacks to the Dollars Trilogy, from the way the stranger shoots hats off heads, lights fuses with cigars, and goes through the whole movie without ever even telling anybody his name. Another reference in High Plains Drifter that's easy to miss can be found in Largo's cemetery, because on two of the tombstones are the names Don Siegel and Sergio Leone, which was Eastwood's way of humorously paying tribute to the two directors that ended up having a huge impact on his career, thanks to his roles as Dirty Harry and the Man with No Name. So in most English-speaking countries, the movie was known exclusively as High Plains Drifter, a vague, non-specific title that played into the mysterious, open-ended nature of the movie. However, this was not the case in other countries, as High Plains Drifter went by lots of other names that all had very different connotations. For instance, in Italy, its title loosely translates to the Nameless Stranger, while in Spain, the movie was known as Hell of Cowards. Meanwhile, in Poland, it was simply called The Avenger, and in Sweden, they went with a title that means The Man with the Ox Whip. So probably the most famous element of High Plains Drifter is its twist ending, which forces you to look at the events of the movie in a completely different light, because it strongly suggested that the stranger is the avenging spirit of Marshal Jim Duncan, who was brutally whipped to death by outlaws while the townspeople just stood back and watched. And we see hints of this in how much the stranger seems to know about the murder, and the biblical manner in which he delivers justice to those responsible. There's also the scene in the hotel where the innkeeper's wife brings up the dead Marshal to the stranger and says,
"Have you ever heard the name Jim Duncan? He was town marshal here. He's lying out there in an unmarked grave. They say the dead don't rest without a marker of some kind."
This is then followed up with the scene in which Mordecai says,
"I never did know your name."
Yes, you do.
And then the camera pans to reveal the name Marshal Jim Duncan, suggesting that this was the stranger's identity all along. However, despite all of this, Clint Eastwood actually always intended for the stranger to be the brother of the Marshal, hence why he cast his stunt double to play the character. But on reflection, Eastwood liked that the ending proved ambiguous enough that it allowed for different interpretations, and has since invited viewers to make up their own minds on who the stranger really was. So when High Plains Drifter finally released, for the most part it was very well received by critics and general audiences alike. For instance, Derek Adams of Time Out said, "This was supposed to be Eastwood's fond adieu to the worlds of Sergio Leone and Don Siegel, and indeed he cuts the operatic excess of the former with the punchy economy of the latter." Equally impressed was Kim Newman of Empire magazine, who called it a funny, brutal, scary movie, daringly surreal in its mix of Western and horror themes. But of course, the movie still had its detractors. For instance, Nigel Andrews of the Monthly Film Bulletin said, "After Play Misty for me, High Plains Drifter emerges as a disappointingly sterile exercise in style, suggesting that the first thing Eastwood should do as a director is forget the lessons he has learned from other filmmakers and start to forge a convincing style of his own." So ultimately, High Plains Drifter went on to make $15.7 million on a budget of just $5.5 million, making it a big box office hit, and remains one of the top grossing westerns of the 1970s. Now, as popular as High Plains Drifter was, it was not without its controversy, due to the graphic, brutal way in which Eastwood approached scenes that involved sex and violence. So Universal had no choice but to release the movie with an R rating, and some of the scenes were deemed so extreme that High Plains Drifter would often air on TV, with lots of parts dramatically cut down and trimmed to avoid offense. Now, possibly the harshest critic of High Plains Drifter ended up being none other than the legendary Western actor John Wayne, because when Eastwood wrote to Wayne about the possibility of them starring in a Western together in the future, Wayne sent back a scathing letter about the movie, denouncing it for its violence and revisionist portrayal of the Old West. And so, Eastwood decided it best not to reply, and ultimately gave up on the idea of ever starring in a movie alongside Wayne. However, on reflection, Clint Eastwood was able to understand why John Wayne hated the film so much, given how far removed it was from a traditional Western, saying, "High Plains Drifter was meant to be a fable. It wasn't meant to show the hours of pioneering drudgery. It wasn't supposed to be anything about settling the West." With Eastwood later going on to say, "I realized that there's two different generations, and he wouldn't understand what I was doing." So although John Wayne wasn't a fan of the movie, High Plains Drifter found plenty of high-profile fans elsewhere. For instance, Shaun of the Dead and Baby Driver director Edgar Wright called it his favourite Clint Eastwood American Western, even above Unforgiven, and felt that it had a big influence on Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill. Also, to this day, High Plains Drifter still features in the book of 1001 movies you must see before you die. So following the success of High Plains Drifter, Clint Eastwood opted to direct another Western 6 years later called Pale Rider. And even now, many still assume that the two films are somehow connected, given that they both feature Clint Eastwood as a mysterious, vengeful stranger in a plot that includes similar supernatural biblical undertones. On top of this, both films open and close in an identical manner, with the stranger riding in from the distance at the start and away into the background at the end. However, Clint Eastwood has confirmed that the two films are entirely standalone and not narratively connected. Although he did admit that High Plains Drifter heavily inspired Pale Rider, as Eastwood wanted to revisit the idea of a Western about a ghostly avenger with a mysterious origin, but in a way that was a lot less cynical and nihilistic than his previous movie. But let me know below, what are your thoughts on High Plains Drifter? Do you think it's one of Eastwood's best, or do you agree more with John Wayne? Also, if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you could leave it a like, and you might also want to check out this video right here.